On one of the coldest mornings of the year, Jake stepped out into his yard, unaware that his life was about to change forever. As snowflakes cut through the air, something caught his eye, a dark shape lying in the snow. He froze. A German Shepherd and her tiny puppy, both unconscious, were abandoned, lifeless, and covered in a thick layer of frost. Heart racing, Jake rushed to their side, desperate to save them from the brutal cold. But as he tried to warm them up, something terrifying dawned on him. This wasn't an ordinary case of neglect. These animals had a past. And what Jake discovered next would send shockwaves through him, revealing a secret that no one could have ever predicted. Get ready, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he knelt down next to the motionless German Shepherd and her tiny puppy. The wind outside howled like an angry beast, but all that mattered in that moment was getting these animals inside, warm and alive. He had no idea how they had ended up in his yard, but it was clear they hadn't been there for long. The mother dog's breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible, while the puppy lay still, its tiny body stiff from the cold. Every instinct in Jake told him to act quickly. Without wasting a moment, Jake gently scooped up the dog and her puppy, wrapping them in his arms and rushing into the warmth of the cabin. The contrast between the freezing cold of the world outside and the warmth inside was jarring, but it gave Jake hope. The room was dimly lit by the flickering flames of the fireplace, casting long shadows on the wooden walls. He set the animals down near the hearth, hoping the warmth would revive them. As he knelt beside them, he noticed how lifeless they seemed, both barely responsive, their bodies too cold to function properly. Jake's fingers trembled as he reached for a blanket to cover them, trying to gently rub their stiff bodies. His mind raced with questions. How could someone leave them like this, abandoned in the snow? Was this some cruel act, or had they simply wandered too far from home and gotten trapped in the storm? Jake knew he wouldn't rest until he had answers. The German Shepherd's eyes flickered open briefly, and Jake felt a surge of relief. The dog wasn't dead, but her gaze was distant, filled with a kind of emptiness Jake couldn't understand. She had been through something that left a mark far deeper than the freezing cold. He could see it in her eyes, a haunted look that spoke of pain and survival. The puppy, though still breathing, remained lifeless in Jake's arms, its little body limp. He was no vet, but Jake knew the first rule. Warmth was essential. He carefully lifted the puppy closer to the fire, wrapping it in a thick towel. The mother, though slightly more alert, seemed reluctant to move. Her eyes followed Jake's every action, but she barely shifted. He wasn't sure if she was too weak or too scared to trust him. It didn't matter. He was determined to help them, whatever it took. Minutes felt like hours as Jake stayed by their side, his every movement calculated. He needed to warm them both, feed them, and most importantly, get them stable. But there was more. The deep, jagged scar across the German Shepherd's neck didn't escape his notice. The wound looked fresh, too fresh to be from an animal attack. Jake's mind began to race. What kind of life had these dogs been living before they ended up here? The scar was a sign, a clue that something had gone horribly wrong in their past. Jake glanced out the window, the wind still howling outside. His mind wandered to what might have happened to them. Were they abandoned by someone who didn't care, or were they a part of something far bigger? Something that explained the scar and the clear signs of trauma. Jake didn't have answers, but one thing was clear. These dogs weren't ordinary strays. There was a story here, and he was determined to uncover it. As the fire crackled, Jake shifted his attention back to the two animals, both of whom were beginning to respond. The puppy's chest rose and fell with slightly deeper breaths, and the mother's eyes were clear, although still filled with uncertainty. The warmth of the cabin was working, but it would take more than just heat to heal them. Jake knew he had to figure out what had happened to them, but for now, he stayed close, watching them both as they slowly recovered, his own questions hanging heavy in the air. This wasn't just about saving two dogs from a snowstorm. It was about discovering a mystery that could change everything. The days following the rescue were filled with tension and uncertainty. Jake hadn't left the cabin since the storm had passed, unsure if the two dogs would make it. The German Shepherd had slowly regained some strength, her breathing steadier, but there was still a sense of wariness in her eyes. The puppy, though, was growing stronger by the hour. It had taken to following Jake around the cabin, its tiny body now full of energy, and its wide, trusting eyes constantly watching him. Despite their progress, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story of how they ended up in his yard. The scar on the German Shepherd's neck gnawed at him. It wasn't just a sign of abandonment, it was something deliberate. He couldn't get the image of it out of his mind. Every time he looked at her, he felt a deep sense of guilt, as if he should have known sooner that something wasn't right. Sitting near the fire one evening, Jake watched as the dogs played with each other on the rug. The puppy nipped at the German Shepherd's tail, and she responded with a gentle growl, rolling over onto her back to play. It was a heartwarming sight, but the gnawing feeling of dread still loomed over him. He had saved them from the storm, yes, but he hadn't saved them from whatever had happened before. Determined to find out more, Jake decided it was time to take a closer look at the scar. He approached the German Shepherd slowly, his hand outstretched, but she flinched, pulling away from him. He paused, letting her calm down before gently petting her. Her eyes softened, and she finally relaxed into his touch. He traced his fingers lightly along the scar, feeling the jagged edges. It was rough, unnatural. Whoever had done this hadn't done it out of malice. It seemed clinical, precise. That's when Jake remembered something. A few months back, he'd heard rumors about a military canine unit in the area. A unit that had been disbanded due to some scandal. Something about misuse. He had never paid much attention to it, assuming it was just another local gossip. But now, with the scar on the German Shepherd, those rumors suddenly felt more real. Could this dog have been part of that unit? And if so, how did she end up here? Abandoned in the wilderness with her puppy. Jake knew he needed to act fast. The questions were piling up, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for the answers. But something inside him pushed him to dig deeper. He couldn't let these dogs' past remain a mystery. They had already suffered enough. The next morning, he decided to drive into town to see if anyone had information about the canine unit. The drive was long, the snow still thick on the roads, but Jake had made up his mind. He wasn't going to let the dog's past slip away unnoticed. As he prepared to leave, the German Shepherd watched him from the window, her eyes full of trust. "I'll be back," he said, his voice low and steady. "I promise." But as Jake stepped into the truck and drove off, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he uncovered about these dogs would change everything. The closer he got to finding the truth, the more uncertain his future seemed. What had happened to these dogs, and how had they ended up in his life? Jake returned to his cabin hours later, his mind racing with what he had just learned. The small town had been bustling with talk about the disbanded military canine unit. The German Shepherd, he had learned, had most likely been one of the top dogs in that unit, trained for high-risk operations and abandoned when the program was shut down. But the more Jake thought about it, the more questions he had. Why had she been left alone in the snow with her puppy? And who had done this to them? When he walked into the cabin, the German Shepherd was resting near the hearth, her puppy curled up beside her. Despite everything, they had started to trust him, to believe that they were safe. The sight of them together filled Jake with both pride and sorrow. He had saved them from the storm, but there was so much more that needed to be done. He sat down beside them, taking a deep breath before speaking softly to the German Shepherd. "I know you've been through a lot, but I promise I'm here to help you. I'm not going to let anything happen to you or your pup." The dog looked up at him, her eyes filled with a strange mix of gratitude and wariness. She seemed to understand that Jake was trying to help, but it was clear she carried the weight of her past with her. Jake couldn't even imagine the things she had gone through, the horrors of being part of a military unit, and then discarded like a tool no longer needed. He wasn't sure if he would ever truly know, but he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't stop trying to help them, no matter what. After a few moments of quiet, Jake got up and went to the small desk in the corner of the cabin. He pulled out his laptop, searching for any information he could find about the disbanded canine unit. The more he read, the more his suspicion grew. There had been stories about mistreatment, about dogs being pushed too far and abandoned without care. He could feel his blood boil as he read. These dogs were no longer just victims of a storm. They were victims of something much darker. As Jake continued his research, the puppy stirred, his tiny body stretching as it woke up. The German Shepherd nuzzled her pup gently, her eyes never leaving Jake. It was as though she was waiting for him to make the next move, to decide what came next for them. Jake paused for a moment, looking at the two of them, He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew he wasn't going to let them go. He had a sense of duty, a connection to these dogs that went beyond just saving them from the cold. Suddenly, his laptop pinged. A message from the local vet popped up on the screen. "Jake, I did some digging into the history of that canine unit. The dog you have, the German Shepherd, was part of something classified. There are no public records, but I've heard rumors of a covert operation involving military canines, ones that were never supposed to be discharged. It's possible your dog might have been part of that. Be careful what you uncover. It could put you and the dog in danger." Jake's heart skipped a beat as he read the message. This was bigger than he had ever imagined. The mystery was deepening, and with it, the stakes were getting higher. He had thought rescuing the dogs from the storm was the hard part. But this was just the beginning. He closed the laptop slowly, feeling a heavy weight settle over him. What had he gotten himself into? And what danger were these dogs truly in? Jake wasn't sure yet, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to back down. He had to find out what happened to them and make sure they were safe, no matter what it took. The next morning, Jake woke up early, the weight of the previous day's discovery still heavy on his mind. The German Shepherd and her puppy were resting peacefully, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The message from the vet lingered in his mind. Be careful what you uncover. He had been hoping for a simple rescue, but instead he had found himself in the middle of a much darker story. What had these dogs been through? Who had used them? And why had they been left to die alone in the snow? He couldn't shake the feeling that his involvement with these animals was no accident. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he might have stumbled into something much bigger than he could handle. But no matter how dangerous it might be, Jake knew he couldn't walk away. He had to find the answers no matter the cost. After a quick breakfast, Jake decided it was time to confront the dogs. The mother dog, though still wary, had come to trust him over the past few days. She watched him carefully as he approached, her eyes filled with a mix of caution and hope. Jake knelt beside her, gently stroking her fur. The scar on her neck was still there, a constant reminder of what she had endured. He needed to know more, needed to understand what had happened to her. The puppy, full of energy and curiosity, bounced around, wagging its tail. It was a stark contrast to the German Shepherd, whose quiet strength seemed to overshadow the puppy's innocent exuberance. As the puppy playfully nipped at Jake's boots, he couldn't help but smile. Despite everything, they were both here, alive and with a chance at a better future. But Jake wasn't sure how to give them that future without uncovering the truth about their past. That afternoon, Jake took the dogs outside, hoping some fresh air would help clear his mind. The snow was still deep, and the mountains in the distance were shrouded in mist. He let the German Shepherd lead the way, watching as she moved with a grace that belied the trauma she had experienced. There was something about the way she moved that told him she had been trained. Every step measured, controlled. She wasn't just any stray dog. She was a soldier. As they wandered through the snow-covered field, Jake's thoughts kept drifting back to the mysterious canine unit. He needed to learn more. The town's local vet had warned him about getting too involved. But Jake couldn't stop himself. The more he uncovered, the more questions arose, and the deeper the mystery became. He had to find out who had done this to the dogs, and why. That night, as the wind howled outside, Jake sat by the fire, deep in thought. The German Shepherd and her puppy lay beside him, both resting but alert. It was quiet, almost too quiet. Jake stared into the flames, wondering what secrets they held. He thought about the scars, the emotional and physical ones, and how they had become a part of this dog's story. Who could have been so cruel? And what would it take to stop it from happening again? A loud knock at the door startled Jake, breaking his thoughts. He stood up, instinctively stepping toward the door. As he opened it, he was met with a familiar face, one of the town's local officers, standing in the snow with an uncertain look on his face. "I heard you've been asking about the military canine unit," the officer said, his voice low and cautious. "I think it's time you heard the full story." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had been hoping for answers, but now that they were finally coming, he wasn't sure if he was ready for what he would learn. Jake stood in the doorway, staring at the officer who had just arrived. The officer's eyes darted nervously, as if he wasn't sure how much he should reveal. The storm had passed, but the cold air still carried an unsettling chill. As the officer stepped inside, his boots crunching on the snow-covered floor. "I don't know how much you've heard," the officer began, looking around the cabin with caution. "But I know you've been asking about the K-9 unit." He paused, clearly uncomfortable. Jake didn't say a word, his eyes narrowing. He wasn't sure if he wanted to hear what the officer was about to say, but he needed answers. "I'll tell you what I know," the officer continued, his voice low. "The K-9 unit you're asking about wasn't just a military program. It was a secret project, one that went under the radar, even in our small town. The dogs used in the unit were often put through extreme training and missions, pushed to their limits. But when the program was shut down, those dogs, well, they weren't treated like they should have been." Jake's heart sank as the officer spoke. He had suspected as much, but hearing it out loud made it feel all too real. These dogs weren't just abandoned. They were part of something much darker, something that left scars deeper than the ones Jake had seen. The officer took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to continue. "Your German Shepherd," he said, looking at the dog lying near the fire, "was one of the best in the program. Trained for high-risk operations, she was put through hell. The puppy too, most likely born in the program. They were discarded, left to fend for themselves when the unit was shut down. No one cared about them after that." Jake's fists clenched at his sides. Anger surged through him, mixing with his grief for the dogs. They had been used, manipulated, and then thrown away when they were no longer needed. The realization hit him hard, and it made everything feel more complicated. These weren't just stray animals. They were survivors of something much bigger, something that had taken everything from them. "The scar on her neck," the officer continued, "was likely from a failed mission. It was common for the dogs to suffer injuries, but they weren't treated like soldiers. When the program ended, they were left to die or abandoned in places like the one you found them." Jake's eyes went to the German Shepherd, who looked up at him with those same haunted eyes. There was so much more to her story, a history full of pain and sacrifice. And now, Jake had a responsibility to help her, help them both. But what did he really know? The more Jake learned, the more questions he had. "Why are you telling me this?" Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't know if he was ready to hear the rest, but there was no turning back now. He had to know everything. The officer's gaze shifted uneasily. "Because I think you're the only one who can help them. But be careful, Jake. These dogs weren't just abandoned. They were part of something much bigger, and if you keep digging, you might attract attention you don't want. People who don't want this past to resurface." The officer paused before speaking again. "I'm giving you this information because I think you can make a difference. But don't go digging too deep. Some things are better left alone." With that, the officer turned and left the cabin, leaving Jake alone with the weight of the truth. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier. The German Shepherd, still recovering, looked at Jake with a calm but knowing gaze, as though she understood the danger they were all in. Jake looked out the window. The snow still falling steadily outside. The wind howled in the distance, but inside the cabin, he was left with the reality of the situation. These dogs had been through hell, and now it was up to him to decide what came next. What had he gotten himself into? And more importantly, what was he willing to risk to help these animals heal from the horrors of their past? Jake sat by the fire, the room growing darker as night fell. The German Shepherd lay beside him, her eyes soft with trust, while the puppy curled up at her side. It was hard to believe that only a few days ago, they had been abandoned in the snow, on the brink of death. Now, the warmth of the fire surrounded them, and they were safe, at least for the moment. But Jake knew that the safety they felt inside the cabin was fleeting. The past was still with them, lurking in the shadows. The officer's words echoed in his mind. Some things are better left alone. But Jake couldn't ignore the truth. He had to know more. He had to understand the full extent of what had happened to these dogs, and why they had been treated so horribly. And yet, with each new piece of information, Jake felt more and more uncertain about the road ahead. His thoughts drifted back to the German Shepherd's scar, to the stories of military missions, and to the corruption that had led to the dog's abandonment. What could he possibly do to help them now? Was it even possible to undo the damage done to them, both physically and emotionally? As the fire crackled, the puppy stirred, stretching its tiny body before looking up at Jake. The German Shepherd followed its movement, then slowly got up to stand by Jake's side. For a moment, their gazes locked, and Jake felt a connection, a bond formed through shared survival. It was a quiet understanding between them. They had both endured unimaginable pain, and now they were healing together. But healing was a slow process. The scars, both visible and invisible, would take time to fade. Jake knew this wasn't just about saving two dogs. It was about helping them rebuild their lives after years of hardship. The question was, could they truly heal? Or were they doomed to live with the remnants of their past forever? Jake took a deep breath and looked out the window. The storm now reduced to a gentle snowfall. The world outside was calm, but inside, Jake felt the weight of his decisions. There was still so much he didn't know. There were people, dangerous people, who would go to great lengths to keep the secrets of the canine unit buried. Jake could feel their presence in the air, as if the very walls of the cabin were closing in on him. He had two choices. He could walk away, let the past remain hidden, and live in peace with the two dogs he had saved. Or he could continue to dig, uncovering the truth, no matter the cost. He knew that if he chose the latter, there would be no turning back. But he also knew that leaving things unresolved would never sit right with him. Not when the truth was so close. As if sensing his internal struggle, the German Shepherd walked over to Jake, sitting quietly beside him. Her eyes were calm, filled with a quiet strength that reminded him of the journey they had been through together. She wasn't just a victim of the past, she was a survivor, and so was he. Maybe, just maybe, they could face whatever came next, together. Jake stood up, taking a moment to look down at the dog. The decision was made. He wasn't going to run from the truth. He had come too far to stop now. I'll find the answers, Jake whispered, more to himself than to the dog. I promise. As the German Shepherd watched him, her expression softening, Jake knew that their journey together wasn't over. It was just beginning. They had a long road ahead, filled with dangers and uncertainties. But with the bond they had forged, Jake felt a sense of hope he hadn't known in years. The fire crackled, the last light of day fading as the storm outside finally came to a halt. Jake knew that, whatever happened next, he wouldn't face it alone. The past was heavy, but together, they could overcome it. As Jake gazed at the German Shepherd and her puppy, he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But together, they had already begun healing. The past was haunting, but the future was theirs to shape. With every decision, Jake proved that no journey was too difficult when it came to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. If you found their story inspiring, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear about hope and resilience. Stay tuned for more incredible stories of survival and strength.